So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, what is the concluding session of this particular course. I'm very happy to have with me today Professor Bharti Harishankar from the Department of Women's Studies, Madras University, and Dr. Merin Simiraj from our very own Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. We also have the two TAs who have been very helpful in this running of the course, Mohit Sharma and Shikriti Sanyal. And we have three research scholars who will introduce themselves in due course of time. So what we'll do in this course, we'll have a generic discussion in terms of the relevance of this course, the content of this course, and we'll attempt to connect it to some of the cultural events which have experienced in contemporary times and also historically. But we'll talk about issues such as reification, radicalization, etc. So it's going to be a free interaction, and hopefully it'll trigger conversation and dialogues for the participants as well as the interlocutors such as yourselves. So let's start with the basics, which is the very key question: why a course like this in the first place? So why do feminist writings? So what's the purpose and the utility of a course in a world we live in today, which is apparently globalized, apparently liberalized, and this equality is a big banner everywhere. So I'll start with Professor Harishankar in terms of the very basic question about the relevance of a course on feminism and feminist writings today. So where do you see this course being situated in the context of our times?
Before answering this question on the relevance of feminist writing, I think we also need to go back and revisit the question of what constitutes feminist writing, because that has changed over the years. So, depending on what we look at as feminist writing today, we can talk about whether or not they are relevant. So, in particular, I'm in fact looking at what began as foregrounding the voices of women is now moving towards capturing the gender spectrum. And there again, I think we said LGBT, and we've added the Q and the I now. So, given that we are expanding the spectrum, what seems to me the basic relevance of a course on feminist writing is to say that there are other voices, and those voices have not been captured. And if they have been captured, have they been foregrounded? So going right back to the question of where is the agency, where is the voice, and which of those voices, one, are audible, and two, which of those voices are making a change. And I would certainly think that making a change is a very crucial aspect of what we mean by feminist writing.
Yeah, great. No, I agree completely. I think agency and articulation are two of the key categories. And like I said, there's be a reconfiguration of agency and the agentic voices, and we can figure out what is marginalized and what isn't marginalized. And these categories are very fluid in quality and very sort of context sensitive as well. So that's a really rich response. I think we can just take it off from here. But Merin, do you have a response to that in terms of the?
Yes, I would entirely agree with what Professor Harishankar just articulated. And there was a time when, in terms of genealogy, in terms of critical tradition, in terms of writings, it was an all-men space, whether literature or cultural articulation. So whatever you take, it was an all-men space. And we all know there were a series of historical events which were responsible for including men, including women, and then there were lots of debates and discussions about it. I think it's all the more relevant in the contemporary to have a course like this, which talks about feminist writings, because now we live in a space, in terms of literature, in terms of culture, there are women everywhere. There's an increasing visibility which almost leads literary and cultural critics to even delude themselves into believing that the problem has been solved. Women are everywhere. There is a great deal of visibility. There are women writers, there are women protesting, there are women activists, there are women occupying every slot in terms of literature, culture, and everything that concerns human living. So it's all the more relevant today to talk about what is feminism and what is feminist writing, because it's important to understand that it's not just about the visibility, it's also about where and in what context these visibilities are framed. If I may quickly recall, in one of the essays by Susi Tharu and Tejaswini Niranjana, it's a post-Mandal essay which appeared, where she talks about the problems for the contemporary theory of gender. So one of her arguments is that just because there are women out there protesting Mandal Commission, it does not mean that the problem ends there. And it becomes all the more difficult. It's a very problematic position when you find women out there protesting something like reservation, where caste also intervenes, and suddenly you realize you cannot take the conventional position of being with women, because that would also put you in a very problematic politics. The another contemporary thing that I can think of is the recent events in Kerala, Sabarimala issue, where again you find women taking a political position and they are out on the streets and they are expressing themselves. But again, the politics of that is very problematic. So I think a course like this and similar courses are very important to understand the crux of feminism, and also not to lose the central argument that this is an ongoing articulation against various forms of patriarchy. There's no standard model. So just because women are visible out there, it does not mean that the problem has been dealt with.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point, because we often delude ourselves, like I said, into believing there's a linear question between visibility and agency, which isn't quite the case at all. And sometimes it works the opposite way. And in the case of Sabarimala, for instance, it was spectacularly visible.
Yes.
Right? It was a spectacle. It was a hyper-real thing. But then, if you think about the agency in question, that becomes a very fragile point. Right? So that's the classic case in point. So thank you both for a very rich response. And open it up for the TAs and the discussants in terms of your responses to this.
Like Merriman said, that despite the visibility, the structures of power are still the same, and this is something that we see in a text like Tickets Please, which is situated in
by D.H. Lawrence,
which is situated in the post-World War scene, and in that story we see how the harassment happens at the workplace, how the imbalance of power is utilized to coerce. It's like a forced consent is being extracted from women, which they have to pay for with their own job, with their own employment, and which leads to their dependency.
Right.
And this is something that we find resonance in the current issues happening both in India and worldwide, issues which result in the Me Too movement, the harassment which has been going through for a long time. Like those cases which have come out now have been there since decades, and those cases have been swept under the rug, and those things have been carried on. And just like in Tickets Please, it erupted at a certain moment, and despite the visibility, despite a much wider spectrum of employment options available now than they were, let's say, 1919, a similar thing is happening. Similar exploitation of power is taking place. So, even older texts can give us a perspective into current issues which are still relevant.
Right. Great. Thanks for that, Mohit. Any other responses to that? In terms of some of the texts that we've covered in this course, the question of visibility and agency, because I think what it comes down to is the question of embodiment, extended embodiment in the social space, and how that becomes problematic, and how the key question of agency actually becomes more fragile with visibility. So that is a very easy question which we delude ourselves and think we moved on from patriarchy because women are seemingly in positions of power. But then that becomes very, very problematic, as you said. So, moving on from that, in terms of looking at feminism today, so like you said at the very beginning, these are historical trajectories, and as students of this particular course, we need to be very mindful of the historical evolution of feminism, as it were. So, how do you see feminism sort of situated today, apropos of the textbook understanding of feminism as a read from the 19th century onwards?
Yeah, the one word I can think of is rhizomic.
Yes.
That's the way feminism is going. But somewhere along, for any particular interpretation, we seem to be isolating strands of feminism.
Right.
So, I would put feminism in the plural today, certainly, feminisms.
Sure.
But at the same time, I would also say there are multiple handles that feminism offers. So, I'm not only talking about the intersectional aspects of feminism, where we are looking at the concerns of caste, class, gender, religion, region, language. But I'm also looking at the kind of theoretical interventions that we see in feminism today.
Right.
Certainly taking a very multidisciplinary projection there. But the bottom line seems to be, whether you're a practicing academic or an activist in feminism, the concern seems to be how to negotiate
Right.
the 3 A's, advocacy, activism, and academics. How do we bring them together?
Right.
And do we need to bring them together at all? See, that would be an open question.
Right.
But certainly, I don't think we can avoid asking that question anymore.
Yeah. And it's interesting you use the word rhizomatic. I mean, would you ascribe a positive attribute to that structure? Do you think that makes feminism more plural and
Absolutely.
inclusive?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think at every point in time, historically, people, but I would in fact say women themselves, have said, okay, we have come to this stage and probably feminism is done.
Right.
So we have been waiting to write the obituary of feminism for a very long time.
Right.
And the fact that we have continued, and more importantly, the fact that certain things have been added as we moved, makes feminism have that rhizomic structure. And we can also look at it the other way and say it's precisely because it is rhizomic that it has moved in different directions and caught those different perceptions.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. Merit, how do you sort of situate yourself in terms of an academic in response to this question of feminism today? So trying on from Professor
I would
Harishankar's.
again like to take off from one of the points that Professor Harishankar made about the binary,
Yeah.
feminist activism and the literary kind of feminism that we are more comfortable in dealing with. So I'm in an ideal situation, perhaps this binary should not exist, but the truth remains that when we practice literary feminism and within a theoretical framework, there's a way in which we begin with the historical conditions, and there's a lot of activism and the political situation which comes in. But when it comes to really reading a text, it seems to be entirely divorced from the historical background and from that trajectory, the chronological, political, historical trajectory through which feminism also came through. And since you're also familiar with one of the texts that you did as part of this course, Gita Hariharan's Remains of the Feast.
Yes.
If you take that text as a case in point, I would say that one way in which you can read the text is as this perfect articulation of feminist politics, where certain kinds of taboos are being overcome through various measures. If you're familiar with the text, you would know the details as well. But I'm also thinking that if one is also conscious and really familiar with certain other ground realities about caste, for instance, which is there loud and clear in the text, but if you go deeper into the text and also analyze the different structures that the text is apparently subverting about Brahmanism, about gender, you also know that there's a certain way in which the text plays within a comfort space. So I think this comfort is something that as academics we are also very comfortable to deal with. Yeah, you look at the text and do not look at what really constitutes the outside of it. And we find this is very, very liberating. Again, coming back to the text, if you look at it and if you see the figure of the grandmother, who is positioned as the radical one, you would also know that there's hardly anything at stake. The family knows that, she cannot threaten any of the structures. They continue to do the rituals in the same way that they have been doing. There is no unsettlement that happens over there, except that the grandmother, and in fact, on the contrary, it appears as an act of benevolence. There is this secular modern family who allows the grandmother to eat laddus from a Muslim vendor, who is allowing the untouchable things to enter their household. There is an act of benevolence, and it's very loud and clear, the act of benevolence as well. And I think one should be able to cross over this binary in this fashion by engaging with the text and also looking at the structures within which the text is situated. I think that would help us to. I do not have a formula in mind even when I say this. Perhaps we do not have the appropriate theoretical frameworks to deal with. But the problem with feminism, something like feminism, is that, like many other theories that we deal with, this is not entirely literary. It emerged from a lot of real historical struggles. So that needs to be taken into account even when we are doing theory, even when we are doing criticism.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting response, because I think we may sometimes run the risk of doing a disservice to feminism in terms of how we deal it purely textually in a classroom, and there's a degree of reification that happens there, which is one of the points I wanted to come in later, but I'm glad it came up right now, the relationship between radicalism and reification. So how can a radical become reified quickly, also get co-opted in a new liberal narrative in terms of the benevolent narrative which you just mentioned. I think that particular text is a really good and strong case in point in terms of appearing to be radical, but then we know that nothing actually changes, where we sort of end up being into this liberal space where Brahmanism and the rituals will just continue posthumously. There is this little ripple in somewhere which is very comfortable to deal with in a domestic space because it doesn't go out in the real world. So in that sense, it's a really interesting text in terms of looking at the ontology of radicalism and whether it's actually radical at all in the culture in which it's situated. Any responses from the scholars and TAs, especially in relation to that particular text, Gita Hariharan's Remains of the Feast?
So just adding on to what you said, I think the hyper-connected nature of today's reality and the fetishistic nature of the medium makes it all the more easier to reify the radical.
Right.
Especially in all the social media and everything that we see.
Right.
So that makes it all the more easier.
Yeah.
But I would like to just raise a query there. So this entire fetishization that you're talking about, is that a very fashionable term now for stereotyping?
Yeah.
Are we coming right back to stereotyping, but we're doing it in such a hyper-connected way that it feels like a reality that you're projecting, benevolent or otherwise. But are we going back to a good old deconstruction of stereotypes?
Yeah.
I think, ma'am, it's a two-way sword kind of a situation where like both of the things are happening simultaneously on the same medium, and like it's sometimes difficult to discern between like which way a certain course is going.
Yeah.
See, I was looking at the larger picture here. See, here we're talking about feminist writing. But I'm in general concerned about what we do as part of gender studies.
Yeah.
Because we have the theories, Indian and outside. But when we look at the material to connect to, and I'm talking about text in a very general sense of very postmodern text, where anything is a text and a discourse. So when we're looking at that situation, where are our texts? And I certainly believe it comes from the groundwork that is being done by activists and people who are advocating feminism at that level.
Right.
How do we make that connect from what happens at the ground level and bring it into our classrooms?
Yeah.
And that always is one point which concerns me a lot, because I feel that we need to give illustrations in class which also goes back to reality.
Right.
I'm not saying it should all the time go back to reality, but it should also go back to reality.
Right.
And where are our instances for our readings? So, do we look at writings literary otherwise, but do we also open out these writings to what happens?
Yeah.
So, these oral narratives, the archives, where are we?
Yeah.
And where are they going to come into our courses, our writings?
Yeah.
I think in this context, we also need to ask the larger question of canon.
Yes.
So when we talk about feminist writings, we are essentially bringing in a set of texts which have already been decided by canon. Canon, if you look at, the traditional understanding, there's a certain kind of a patriarchy which is woven into it.
Yeah.
So maybe there should be a way in which we can break out of those boxes as well, and bringing in texts which are non-canonical, but again, as Professor Harshan also pointed out, there's again a risk over there about these non-canonical things again becoming the canon in different ways. So there should be a system by which, there is some kind of a flexibility should always be built in not allowing the canon to solidify in some way or the other.
I think the risk of normalization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Every time there's a canon, and you feel it's being normalized.
And normativized as well.
Yes, and normativized.
Yes.
So how do we overcome that?
That's a really interesting question, because I think that connects to some of the key things about policies in institutions in terms of syllabus creation and content creation. And I think that's a really burning question in terms of the dialogue between what happens in the world out there and what happens in our classroom. And I think we as academics are sort of, in a way, responsible to a certain extent. We should be held accountable to a certain extent for this insularity that is there in the classroom. So where do you see the way out of this in terms of making it more dialogic? So do you think that can happen through seminars, the conventional processes, or do you think there should be a bit of a path-breaking thing which should be done in terms of making it more inclusive, academics and activists collaborating? So how do you think that could potentially happen?
Yes, certainly collaboration is a way forward, the way I would look at it. But as academics, since we know that aspect better, I would say let's start from there.
Right.
The kind of rigor we bring into research, and I think the charm of doing feminist research is to have that self-reflexive subjectivity.
Right.
And can we formalize it? Can we theorize that? And bringing that theorization into our interpretations, into our teaching. See, I think feminist research methodology would differ from, say, any social science research. Is one, it would insist on the subjectivity. But it would also put a caveat there saying, let it be subjective, but let it be self-reflexive first. So that in the name of subjectivity, we are not bringing in biases and prejudices,
Right.
but we are actually making ourselves aware of those biases and prejudices. And I would say that one aspect, if we can bring it into our classrooms, especially on feminist writings and studies, we will do a really good work there. Because for every theory or a concept that we read in this course, there is a reality out there which has created that concept in the first place.
Right.
But for us to grasp the concept better, we need to go back to that reality as well.
Right.
So I look at it as a very continuous to and fro movement. And that to and fro movement may be important not only in the teaching learning, but also in the interpretation.
Absolutely. So I suppose what we are hoping for in the not distant future is a more healthy balance of theory and praxis.
Yes.
In terms of having not just a collaborative but a more symbiotic relationship between what happens in the field, in the real world, and what happens in the classroom, and not necessarily compartmentalize those as watertight categories. Any responses from the TAs and the scholars?
Hello, I'm Shiji. I'm a research scholar in this department. Ma'am, I would like to add on to what you have said. Talking about feminism in this today's perspective, today's world, it's like it should be like going back to the roots, because these texts, whatever we are learning, it came because of a kind of activism which emerged at that point of time, and then this text came back. So adapting these texts in this particular real life scenario, and interpretation of it in this today's world matters a lot.
So on the TAs, we would be able to sort of throw some light on it in terms of some of the texts we have covered in this course, which potentially, let's say something like Judith Butler, or even de Beauvoir, for instance. So how do you situate them in terms of discussion we're having? Because, on one hand, they are, superstar academics, their content is always anthologized and university syllabi across the world. But how important is it to take them out of the textbook and situate them in a way of understanding the gender politics happening in the world out there? So what would be your take?
So I think when we are talking about, say, Beauvoir, so what is very interesting that she has done is open up the position of woman as a construct, right? So it's looking at different aspects of it, from be it the sociological perspective, political, cultural, medical. So she critiques it from all the historical and critiques from all the angles, and sees that how a woman, as we say, know it now, that it's not born, and how one becomes a woman. So and during the time of the second wave movement, I think it is a very seminal work, because again it throws a very constructionist perspective to the category of woman, which is not sex biological based or sex based. But when we obviously, when we come to the third wave, and which Butler represents, and she carries forward what Boover is saying, but she puts a very different and interesting notion, a very third world approach to it, and questions the category of the woman itself, which problematizes everything. That again, speaking from a very hardcore point of theory, because when we talk about activism, probably this question doesn't come, because we know who are the women, and the second wave has consolidated that category, that there's the feminine consciousness that is there. They are the women. But then when we come to third wave, and we have distinguished between sex and gender, and then and asking a question as in who can speak in the name of a woman. And when we know that, as ma'am said, that there are many feminisms now, it's not only one category, and every identity is fluid. Even if we are aspiring for a subjectivity, it is subjectivities. Right. So how can a person, or how can we take a stand? Or how like identity politics has been heavily criticized before, or especially in the third wave, and it does not, because again we speak from a particular position that is singular and that is monolithic, and it has to be, everything has to be plural and fluid, so that we are inclusive, and like, it's not that we have to be. I mean, that is what we need. That is what feminism is for as a theory. So I think Boover, if you bring her Butler, if you talk about Judith Butler, then it further complicates the issue of who is the woman and in whose name are we talking. But then I think Butler also says that even if we understand that woman is not a singular category, it is plural, but we also recognize that there is a need to speak from a position. Otherwise, how do you negotiate the different discourses around you, and how do you channelize yourself through them? So I think that is a very important thing, that to recognize that the woman is not just a woman born with the biological sex of being a woman. It can be, the definition can be expanded, and it is multiple and fluid and changing, evolving all the time. And but then even then we need to speak about it, just like there is a disability studies perspective, or a class perspective, or race perspective, and different other perspectives. That's
very interesting, because what that does is it brings us one of the most heated debates we keep having, not just in feminism, but I suppose in all isms, the relationship between essentialism and constructionism. To what extent, suppose when you say something is a construct and we sort of deconstruct it, there's a degree of liberation about it. But then when it comes to only a certain identity, a certain degree of essentialism is probably helpful as well, to a certain extent. So how do you see, as an academic, this sort of very fine tuning between essentialism and constructionism? So,
at least in relation to feminist studies, I look at it as the balance that we need. All of us strive to strike between positioning and performing.
Right.
So, to what extent do we position ourselves vis-a-vis an idea or a construct, and to what extent do we perform the construct?
Right.
And in my opinion, I think till we position ourselves, we are rather clear about where we are coming from.
Right.
But the minute we start the performative aspect, I think inevitably a sense of essentialism, which in the initial stages we try to position. But somewhere along we seem to, somehow let go of that grasp. But I'm not saying it is necessarily wrong. In fact, in my opinion, that gives the variety that we bring into feminist texts today is precisely because of that. We can alternate, and we can very consciously alternate between one and the other.
Merin, what would be your response to?
Yes, I think Professor Harshanga has very lucidly put it, to be able to understand where we are coming from. I think that could be one of the starting points which can help us reorient the question of canon itself. For instance, we all would agree that there would be certain feminist discourses which are predominantly considered as feminist, that can come across as alienating and even threatening to certain other communities and even other women. I think you must have discussed this text, Yellow Wallpaper, as part of your course. And it is seen as this embodiment of feminism, the feminist text, one of the pioneering texts, but it's very, very white, and that has been critiqued as well. The whiteness of it and the social structures within which the text is situated, that can come across in very, very alienating and even threatening to someone who does not inhabit those social spaces. So I think in our context, in the Indian context, that would again perhaps make more sense. The kind of feminism that even today that we come across, if we take some examples from the contemporary social media, Me Too movement, much as we all completely support the need for it and the ways in which it is radically changing the ways in which social space is constructed and deconstructed, we must also be attentive to the fact that this is a space which only certain kinds of women can access. The language of it is very, very alienating to someone who does not inhabit this urban metropolitan centers, who does not have access to that kind of language and the frameworks within which the movement itself works. So unless one is attentive to these things as well, I think there is a real danger of feminist discourse itself becoming another kind of patriarchal framework within which some kind of a licensed patriarchy works within academics.
Yeah.
And I guess that's something as academics we should also be very attentive to.
Yeah. I suppose, what is interesting is how patriarchy can operate covertly in certain discourses, while seeming to be liberating and liberal and all the rest of it. But it's actually embedded in a very covert patriarchal discourse, which is always a danger, and it runs the risk of reification as well. But it's really interesting. You mentioned the Yellow Wallpaper, and I think it's one of the most problematic texts which you've covered in this course so far. When the whiteness of it is just stares at your face, despite all that has been said about the female agency and the medical trauma and the masculinity and medical sort of collusion that happens as a result of which there's a subjectivity of the female subject. But then, of course, the whiteness is something which is very much a part of the discourse, and that is a very covert patriarchy which is operated in that seemingly radical text. So to sort of connect that to my TAs who have covered it quite extensively, how do you situate that particular text in the larger narrative of feminism, Yellow Wallpaper?
So, before answering your question, I had a question just when you mentioned Yellow Wallpaper and while we were doing it. So, and we were talking about female agency, and the text talks about hysteria and the woman hysteric, and when she actually, the narrator tears down the wallpaper, and it's some kind of agency as she has saved herself from the medical imprisonment and she comes out. But so I would like to question this position of the hysteric. So when we talk about certain theorists or feminists have seen this as a very liberating position, where the woman can go out of the discourse, the patriarchal discourse, and set up and construct and talk about, express her feelings in a more empathetic or giving her way to her emotions. While a different school of feminists are seen as a very limiting position, which again brings the woman to that same binary of irrationality and confines her within it. So I would like to ask what do you think about it? I mean, what is the way around it? So would you like to see the position of the hysteric as agentic position, or one that again confines the woman within the same binaries?
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't like to look at the position as one way or the other. More than a position, it's a space. So the space of being hysterical, if that offers a point for negotiation, I think it's welcome. Because it doesn't compromise with the sense of agency. But at the same time, if the label of a hysteric is put on them from outside, that is where I think we need to be a little careful. Because who is authorized to define a person as hysteric? I'm of course not talking about medical conventions here, but in general, who is authorized to label another person? And I'm going right back to this politics of naming. So when a woman shouts, does it become hysterical? Then you want to ask what happens when a man shouts, what happens? So I think two related aspects need to be looked at in this. One, there are certain things we cannot look at as positions. So here I think the act or fact of being hysteric can provide the much needed space to negotiate and articulate. That is one. But on the other hand, it also raises the question of who is authorized to name someone, call someone hysteric. or is a perception on the part of the individual herself.
I think I agree completely on that, because space becomes a big deal in terms of gender performances, and each form of embodiment as it's gendered is very spatial in quality that deeply informs different degrees of embodiment. But I was intrigued by what you said about the whole politics of naming and this entire classification which is medically done, because I was thinking of First World War, when the soldiers came back from the war and they were hysterics. They exhibited all symptoms of hysteria, but of course, because they were big guys, they couldn't be named hysterics. So they had to coin a term for it, shell shock, and no one quite knew what that meant. And this entire medical confusion around shell shock was precisely because they couldn't come up with a classification quickly enough at that point in time, which is why where and when, interestingly, Freud became very handy. Right, because he just comes in at the perfect moment when the British neurologists are struggling to understand what's happening with these big guys who are shivering like children and women. I think the term that they used was malingerous and shiverous. But it was very quickly reclassified. So hysteria moved from being a disease of the womb to something that can affect even muscular guys coming back from the trenches who are traumatized by the horrors of the war. Which brings us to the broader question of classification, which I think we've been discussing sort of extensively already. The whole idea of classifying or labeling groups, which can sometimes appear to be liberating in quality, appear to be radical in quality, but that can again quickly sort of feed into the whole idea of reification. The moment you classify someone as a group, whether it's LGBT or gay or lesbian, isn't there a degree or a danger of reification, even that classification as well? Because you're sort of saying that that subject is compromised and restricted in terms of being just that and nothing else.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely. I mean, I think we can go right back to this Indian construction of the image of Kali.
Yes.
For instance. So on the one hand, we're very quick to differentiate Kali from the more benign pantheon of goddesses.
Yes.
But at the same time, look at the colonial construction of the Bengali Babu as an effeminate because he worships Kali.
Right.
So, see, that is where I see the danger of labeling.
Yeah.
I mean, you label a thing or a person in relation to a very specific moment and context. But we are very quick to take it away from that context and extrapolate.
Yeah.
And that extrapolation is, in my opinion, pretty dangerous because we do two related mischiefs there. One is we take it out of the original intent and provide an intent where it was not meant. And as an extension of that, we also take it as a point of contestation. And not all times do you have a contestation there. So, in fact, quite surprisingly, when I was reading up on the perceptions on Kali in the Indian imagination, it surprised me that Sister Nivedita had a perception coming from outside, which should have, technically speaking, emerged from within India.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because I was thinking of Munal Bisna's work on the whole idea of the feminine, or the apropos, the masculine British. And what's also interesting is how that masculine British got informed by the Boy Scout movements, the Baden Powell things, which in turn borrowed quite heavily from Indian, military. For instance, the Tipu Sultan, regiment. That was what the sartorial, the mustache of Tipu Sultan, that informed the Baden Powell masculinity, which gets very effectively effaced. No one talks about that at all, and that seems to be a British invention at all, completely. So the sartorial markers, these sort of embodied markers, I think they are, like you said, they're sometimes very effectively and strategically effaced away in terms of completely divorcing the context and making some kind of a timeless, universal category of femininity or masculinity, which then gets very conveniently co-opted into broader narratives as imperialism, colonialism, etc. Merin, how would you like to respond to this whole idea of classification and the dangers of classification, as it were?
I think it's all about who gets to label and who gets to categorize. And that also essentially brings in this element of power, the structures within that operate. If I may go back to the example that Sukriti used when she asked this question about the category of hysteria and the text being
Yellow Wallpaper.
the text being the yellow wallpaper. So look at the ending of the text. It's a very powerful ending. But there's also a sense in which we get that there are certain images, there are certain labels which can be used only to talk about women. We find the man fainting at the end.
Yeah.
The man faints at the end, but that becomes, it's almost like telling us that it became too big for him to handle it, but there's no term to talk about it. Yeah? The story, it's a very powerful story, especially at the ending when we are being told that, yes, the woman emerges as the stronger one in this entire discourse, and at the end of it, we realize that the weaker man does not get labeled. On the other hand, from conventional readers, and there were a lot of publishers, as you know, during that time, who sympathized with the man, because this was not something that he was supposed to encounter. And the fact is also that the man in the story, the moment he encounters something which he has never encountered before, he just cannot take it. He collapses. But there's no term to categorize that. It's an aberration. If we extrapolate that into any of the circumstances, any of the situations that we deal with in the contemporary, whether within the academic spaces, within the discourses, or within the other kinds of articulations that we find in the culture and the politics, there is a way in which certain set of people always get to name, always get to label, they always get to categorize. And they always circumvent those things which are inconvenient. And I believe that in terms of feminist discourse, in terms of engaging with feminist writings, unless one begins to engage with those inconveniences, we may not be able to push past these boundaries and these delimiting categories. So it's always easy to deal with categories and labels. And so instead of adopting the labels and the categories which have been handed over to us, as it was evident in the examples that we just discussed too. So I think it's important to step back and look at who had labeled particular thing as X, Y, or Z in the first place, and look at those conditions within which the labeling and the categorization happened. So that is perhaps one of the steps that we need to take. This also ties up very neatly with the question of canon making, the question of agency.
Yeah, completely. Because one needs to be mindful of the materiality of labeling. Labeling is not an abstract activity. It's a very material activity which has solid economic underpinnings, political biases, ideological biases, as a result of which certain labelings happen. So the materiality which informs the process of labeling is something, obviously it's effaced away, effectively. You don't get to know the material economic conditions which took place, which inform that directly. But once that's dug up and studied and examined as textual categories, then it becomes easier for us to understand the whole politics of labeling. But which sort of brings me, because I was thinking about your point about self-reflexivity, and I sort of thought that's a really important point, because one of the things which fascinates me about feminism as a student is the way it allies itself to so many other movements around that time. And I'm thinking particularly about French feminism, the 60s movement, and the degree it borrows or it sort of lends itself in a very dialogic way to post-structuralism, right? So how do you think these alliances work in feminism? Historically, of course, we know how alliances work. But looking at it today, how do you see feminism connecting itself symbiotically and sort of dialogically with some of the movements around the world? Let's say the whole refugee crisis movement or the immigration policy movement. So do you think feminism has sort of potentially this dialogue with these things in terms of connecting and maybe enriching itself, drawing on these movements?
The answer to that is actually yes and no.
Yeah.
Because yes, it is dialoguing, so we do have, we have had a lot of these intersections and interactions happening, which is, whether it is with Marxism or psychoanalysis or postmodernism, postcolonialism. So the list is fairly endless. The types of feminisms capture the kind of interactions that have been there. And I see the value of those interactions in two ways. One is certainly all these theories have had an impact on the way feminism has shaped as a theory. But what I find even more interesting is the way feminism answers back to them.
Right.
And I think if we study the dynamics of that answering back, that dynamics itself is amazing.
Yeah.
Because it covers most of the points that we raised in our discussion today.
Yes.
Just by going back and asking, yes, this may be useful for many things, but is it useful for this particular idea too? Is gender included in this?
Yeah.
One idea, it seems like a very simple question, but even when you do your Foucault, for instance,
yes.
or Foucault's sense of discipline and power or micropolitics of power, time and again, you feel like asking the question, hey, by the way, is gender included in this? You don't know.
Yeah.
See, we kind of adopt and adapt it to look at feminist texts.
Right.
Whereas, I don't think these theories by themselves would have led to anything. But I think it is the way of the engagement between feminism and these theories that has actually come up with some very interesting questions for us.
Yes.
I don't think we have answers.
Yes.
But certainly these are very important questions to raise.
Right. Interesting. So I just throw this to the scholars, because I'm aware that you come from different research clusters. So how do you see feminism connect to some of the clusters you're more aware of, let's say postmodernism, or post-structuralism, or post-colonialism? As you experience as researchers, how do you see that connection operate at a textual level or even at an experiential level?
Hello.
Yeah.
My name is Rajesh Srivastav and I am a research scholar at IIT Madras. Now, since we're talking about the Yellow Wallpaper, there is another text that comes to my mind, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, American Literature, which was also criticized for being very white in terms of its feminist approaches. So that brings me to a question. Aren't we using feminism according to our conveniences? Right? Because in that text we see there is a white woman who is cornered by her own problems. And then there is a maid, a working woman, who is not taken into consideration of feminism. Right? And that brings me to the idea of sisterhood, which I think we are not using as effectively as it has been projected in theories, where we practice sisterhood in texts, in literature, but not in reality, be it family, be it workplace. Because we must have heard of women being agents of patriarchy, right? And that is what I would like to question.
Okay, when you mentioned Kate Chopin, I was in fact thinking of this entire literary debate that came up when Jean Rhys wrote the White Sargasso Sea, and how it centers the madwoman in the attic. But the Canadian responses to White Sargasso Sea, interestingly, focused on the characters of Tia and Christophine, and said, when the Creole identity come in, and how do we deal with them? So my response, I don't know if it is an acceptable response, but my response is that all of these things have a ripple effect, and there are ripples go far and wide. But I think at any given point in time we actually disrupt the ripple itself and assume that this is the way it goes. Okay? And that is why I think, this, as you rightly questioned, why is it that we are not able to look at the sisterhood, which is such a lovely theoretical concept? Why is it not getting practiced? I would say we are holding too many handles, and we don't know which handle to choose at any given point in time. The handle of being a woman, the handle in terms of your caste, your class, your urban location, for instance. So I think we have far too many handles there.
Yeah.
But I would still say it is better to have those handles because the option we have is a binary.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we certainly don't want the binary, even if some concepts like sisterhood cannot be applied in toto.
Do you think this, what you mentioned now, and the idea of mischief that you mentioned previously, do you think this is a kind of a inherent danger or a potential danger in the rhizomatic development of feminisms, each feminism developing from their own places, and there they interact with different discourses which also originate in a similar environment, and the way those interactions between discourses, the way they shape culture and the way they shape things around them can have a counterproductive effect on another discourse of feminism itself.
No, absolutely. I mean, that concern is a very valid concern. I mean, when we talk about the joy, the kind of risk that a rhizomic structure provides you, this danger is always there. However, what I have found in almost all the intersections that we talk about in relation to feminism, I think the primary focus is on the feminist there and the gender construct. So, we are prioritizing one over the other. I'm not looking at them as one taking away and an influence that can disrupt what had happened earlier, but I look at it as a perspective that is added. And in my opinion, we've already had a lot of rhizomic expansion within feminism, and it was what disrupted the core with which we started in our movements. So given that, I am personally not worried, because I feel that we need to raise those inconvenient questions. Because when a theory gets formulated, I think in the early years the theory doesn't have to worry, because it's coming out of one ideology, it's coming out of one context, and we are all aware of the context. But when it moves beyond the context historically, that is when I think we need to be a little worried whether, as Merlin rightly pointed out, we move right back and create a canon out of this so-called periphery or margin. And I think precisely the question that you raised, will they be counterproductive? If they are counterproductive, to the extent that it questions that kind of canon formation. In fact, I could even add over there, unthinking canon formation. I think it's doing its job. We need it. So I don't necessarily see it as a problem.
There's a thin line between plurality and problem, right? I mean, on the one hand, if you sort of accept plurality, you obviously open up your Pandora's box, as it were, which could be an inconvenience. But I think, as Merlin pointed out, as the way we look at feminism today, we need to not just accept but also celebrate inconvenience in a way, because in a way that cuts out a complete seamless narrative which gets very easily co-opted into patriarchy, and other forms of patriarchy such as nationalism, consumerism, capitalism, etc. So that inconvenience becomes, I think, it's a discursive phenomenon which must be accepted and celebrated and articulated over and over again. And that interruption, inconvenience, and these are also very postmodern categories in a way, right? Because that adds on to your idea of self-reflexivity, where you self-critique yourself all the time, and therein lies the resistance, if I can use the word resistance, against any danger of unification. Because if you're breaking yourself all the time, discursively, thematically, ontologically, and if you accept and articulate inconveniences and interruptions, then I think that itself becomes a resistance against any meta-narrative which could be ascribed onto you as a category. So, I mean, just to sort of ask you the question again, so in terms of looking at inconveniences, Merlin, would you situate feminism as a movement which sort of dialoguing with inconveniences? Is it like, as Mohit was mentioning, the question that is a very commonsensical question in terms of whether or not that undercuts some of the motivations of feminism. But do you think that's a risk worth taking in terms of being more inclusive?
Of course, it also depends on how we engage with gender and feminism. For example, in our context, if we try to make gender and caste sit together, there would be like plenty of inconveniences which would suddenly emerge. Because there's a certain kind of feminism, a certain brand of feminism which upper caste feminists celebrate, and that is something that Dalit feminists find very, very problematic. So the moment caste comes in, whatever is seen as progressive, as modern, begins to look very obnoxious, to say the least. And And that is something which becomes visible only when you look at gender and caste together. Yeah? If you only look at gender and look at feminism as a very ideal state, then it's a perfect thing to have.
Yeah.
But when you inject caste to it, and for instance, if you bring in a certain Dalitness to it, just like in the West, you bring in a blackness to it, you begin to see that this is really not perfect. This is a convenient thing. A convenient thing which will ensure that patriarchy does not affect me, and at the same time, I will not get categorized with the other. So it will ensure that I will not be categorized as the other in terms of a patriarchal system, but it will also make me stay immune against the other kinds of things, which could be lower caste, which could be lower class. So I think that is something which we still do not have a theoretical framework to deal with it.
Yeah.
So, which is why perhaps this reliance on theory also becomes a very problematic thing.
I mean, not least because of the Eurocentric biases of those theories.
Yes.
Right? Because that's where the most theory industry comes from, and if you're sort of very blindly mapping those theories into the lived reality in certain situations, then it becomes a wonderful textual experience. It reads wonderfully as a text and is very attractive in a classroom, but then to what extent is it actually viable or helpful in the reality out there? That becomes a very key question. So I think as academics we need to be careful about how we use theory as well, in terms of how we map theory in certain lived realities. So where will you place, I mean, that's a very generic question I know, but how will you sort of caution students against this blind mapping of attractive theories such as deconstruction and post-structuralism onto, let's say, Dalit feminism? What would be your voice of caution to students practicing this?
Okay, one is, of course, as I think Diana Bryden puts it, this was the older days with post-colonialism, and she said, let's not put, the empire like bandage to heal things up. So we are not really looking at theory as a quick fix to read a text. I think that's one danger that all of us, there's a lot of temptation out there in terms of theory. So, it's very easy to find a theory. And there are theories for which we don't find a text to map. So I think that's certainly one caution I would give. And I can also tell you from practice that it's really a good idea to look at the underlying philosophy to a theory. Because very often when we use just a few concepts out of those theories, they seem fine. But if you go right back and then, say for instance, even Simon de Beauvoir, if you realize that it's coming from an base of existentialism, how do you look at the whole concept of the other? So I think that would be certainly one caution. I mean, let's not jump into the theory bandwagon because the theory is there. That is one. Second is, at what point in the text do we bring in that? So, do we read the text, let the text open out, and then you say, okay, this connects up. This particular idea can be better explained through a theory. That's one way of doing it. But having said this, I must also say that theory certainly gives a structure to the way we interpret the text. So we cannot really say no theory from today.
Sure, yeah.
Because a theoretical structure to your interpretation actually makes that interpretation at least articulated in a way where people can take it or leave it. See, otherwise I think we will end up just talking thematically.
Yes.
And connecting it up to a lived reality, but certainly a very confined reality. So we certainly don't want that.
Yeah.
So that opening out certainly happens with theory. So that is why I feel both theory and text is a balancing act. But the minute we say one is more important than the other, I think we run a problem.
Yeah.
But I also agree with you about the Eurocentric baggage that we have. Some of those are broad enough that we are able to apply. So somewhere along, I think Foucault seems pretty versatile to be applied. I mean, we were doing that with Freud for quite a long time, and then, so So certainly, and again, Derrida, while the philosophers were still trying to find out what's happening, we as literature students wrapped up deconstruction. So I think somewhere along, it's also fashionable to cite and follow a few theories. But I don't think if we follow this notion of let's look at the theory, let's adopt it, yes, but let's adapt it as well. So I don't think all aspects of a theory has to fit in your scheme of interpretation. Not needed at all. But we somehow feel forced to just stick to one theorist. So when we are doing upfront, whether it's our research papers or our dissertations and theses, we are quick to say a psychoanalytic approach or postmodernist approach, a deconstructionist approach, or a feminist approach or an intersectional feminist approach. So I think we don't have to rush to that choice of a theory that quickly. I think we have enough choice to make a combination. And I think more than in any other field, feminist writing allows you that opportunity. You can only say, I want to look at this particular idea from this theory, but I want to combine it. To offer a better interpretation, a new insight into my text, into the text that I'm dealing with. So I think that option is there, and we've probably not exercised that option very well till now.
No, I completely agree, because there is a danger of some degree of hyper-intellectual consumption, where you consume certain theories as intellectual and just blindly replicate it in textbooks. And like I said, there's very frozen mathematical models where you apply psychoanalysis to reciprocity, apply the Hahnemann theory to Hitchcock, and draw wonderful readings out of it. But that obviously is very limiting and reified. So I think we can end with that really interesting note, because to what extent is theory liberating, to what extent is theory, as Merrin put it, more accommodating to inconveniences. And I suppose that connects us back to the fundamental question with which you open the relevance of feminism today. That in a way, that would probably equip us better to negotiate with inconveniences, and not negate inconveniences, but to accept and celebrate inconveniences as a way to move forward in a world we live in today, in a way we internalize today. And perhaps that acceptance and celebration of inconvenience would make us more self-reflexive, as you pointed. And therein lies the political possibilities of feminism, not just as a classroom text, but also as a movement which we can internalize and contest some of the acts of consumption that we do as thinking human beings in the world we live in today. So with that, we end this particular session. Thank you very much again to the two resource persons, Professor Hari Shankar and Dr. Merrin Simiras, and also the two TAs of this course, Shikriti Sanyal and Mohit Sharma, and then to the research scholars who attend the session. So thank you very much. With that, we come to the conclusion of Feminist Writings, the NPTEL course that we ran from January 2019. Thank you.